John Brennan revealing for the first time that he was concerned about contacts between Russian officials and the Trump campaign last year. And he told lawmakers today that he feared the Russians have often tried to lure people down a, quote, treasonous path to act on Moscow's behalf, either willingly or without even knowing it. Now, the White House is putting its own spin on this hearing, claiming it shows there is no evidence of collusion, even though Brennan pointedly refused to say that. Now, as this investigation intensifies, CNN has confirmed that Mr. Trump is expected to take a significant new step and hire a personal lawyer, turning to a powerful attorney that he's relied on before by the name of Mark Kasowitz. Also tonight, the Senate Intelligence Committee is keeping alive the threat that it will hold fired National Security Advisor Michael Flynn in contempt of Congress for defying a subpoena. But first, the panel says it's issuing new subpoenas for Flynn's businesses because businesses can't invoke Fifth Amendment rights, as Flynn is promising to do. So, Jim, potentially damaging testimony today from the former CIA director.
Directly contradicting, really, the story we've been hearing from the White House from some months now. The former CIA director making clear today that some of the most troubling aspects of Russian interference in the U.S. election remain very much under investigation. First, Brennan confirmed repeated contacts between Trump advisors and Russians during the campaign.
I encountered and am aware of information and intelligence that revealed contacts and interactions between Russian officials and U.S. persons involved in the Trump campaign that I was concerned about because of known Russian efforts to suborn such individuals, and it raised questions in my mind, again, whether or not the Russians were able to gain the cooperation of those individuals.
Now, the White House seized on his comments as somehow confirming that the FBI has found no proof of such cooperation, saying, quote, despite a year of investigation, there is still no evidence of any Russia-Trump campaign collusion, end quote. But in fact, that is not what Brennan said. In fact, he said the question of collusion remains, quote, unresolved.
And I was worried by a number of the contacts that the Russians had with U.S. persons. And so therefore, by the time I left office on January 20th, I had unresolved questions in my mind as to whether or not the Russians had been successful in getting U.S. persons involved in the campaign or not to work on their behalf, again, either in a witting or unwitting fashion.
We're joined now by CNN's team of reporters. We've been following this story really in depth for a number of weeks now. Gloria, you look at these moments here. First of all, the White House denied and even called out its CIA director and others to challenge that there were repeated contacts of this when we in the New York Times reported it some months ago.
Right.
But on this question of collusion again today, as the president repeated, saying, they've said there's no evidence of collusion. That's not what the CIA director said.
No, it's not what he said. He said that there was a 5-alarm fire going on, and he didn't know how to put it out. I mean, we learned today that the CIA director alerted the FBI. Not only did he alert the FBI, but he went to his counterpart in Moscow and said, you guys better cut this out. Not only did he do that, but he held a classified briefing with senior leadership in the Congress. And then, after that, he went to the President of the United States, Barack Obama, and said, this is something we have to be concerned about. So when we've been reporting all along about these conversations, whether it was with Russians or Russia to Russia, as we reported last week, we now are getting a fuller picture of just how concerned the Obama White House was about this before the Trump team took over.
And to be clear, they were concerned, and intelligence officials were concerned, Evan, not just about that Russia was interfering in the election, but that they were picking up conversations between Trump advisors and Russians during the election.
Right. His big concern at this point, as he described it, and this is really important testimony today because it's the first time we've heard from one of these officials publicly saying exactly what was going on behind the scenes, including the fact that the CIA, the FBI, and the NSA basically got together a task force to take a look at this. And, you know, he described how his big concern was that maybe someone was already turned inside the Trump campaign and was doing the work of Russian intelligence. That's incredible words to come.
It's a remarkable question to raise.
It's the strongest language we've heard yet from an official, a former official in this case. And, you know, as you'll recall, we reported some time ago that there was concern among law enforcement and intelligence that Russians were trying to use Carter Page, who was considered by some a Trump advisor, Trump campaign advisor, trying to have him infiltrate the campaign. And so as they're watching these communications play out, as you point out, the concern necessarily isn't from the Trump side, it's the Russians. What are they trying to do to these people to get them to campaign and basically be spies?
Well, and that's when he said it was wittingly or unwittingly.
Right.
So, you know, he was sort of making the point, and I don't know whether he had Carter Page in mind, but whether you know it, buddy, they were trying to turn you. You may not have been aware of it.
Exactly.
Dan, infiltration of a U.S. presidential campaign. Again, they haven't established this as being successful. He raised that here today, but he also has not eliminated that.
Hasn't eliminated it, but the way that he told this story, which was really out of a Jim Clancy novel, except that it was real, was remarkable, and it was riveting to hear his testimony. And I just want to underscore that something that you all have noted, but I think it bears repeating, that what this man said, who was the director of the CIA, real time, underscored and confirmed what everybody at this table has been reporting, and then some, about all of the concerns inside the intelligence community, inside the law enforcement community, about what Russia was trying to do vis-a-vis the Trump campaign. And I think to your point, Jim, what he did not say was they weren't successful. What he did not say was they didn't make it. He said, we don't know yet. And it is still very much an open question.
And that's a consistent point from whether it's Brennan today, Clapper earlier. Often their comments are misinterpreted or misconstrued, frankly.
The White House does that intentionally. The president says that. Well, when James Clapper says he's seen no evidence, that means that there is no collusion. But in fact, when James Clapper testified himself before the congressional committees, he said that he didn't know because the FBI was investigating this issue, and he actually had a firewall of sorts between himself as the director of national intelligence and the FBI. Similarly here, even though John Brennan says he has not seen any evidence, does not mean that he does not mean that there is no evidence. It just means that he had concerns and he passed this along to the FBI.
One quick point I want to make here, and just to step back at this, we've all been facing the criticism from the Trump administration, the White House, and some of his supporters that, you know, we won't drop this story. And the reason for this is that all throughout the campaign and even through the transition, we heard from them repeatedly that there were no such contacts, there was none of these communications. We're hearing this now straight from the mouth of the former CIA director that there were. And now he's saying it publicly. And so this is why when they say these things, people don't believe them anymore. And that's why we have to wait and see how these investigations.
And I just want to say for the record, I know it's Tom Clancy, not Jim Clancy. He was our colleague. Everybody out there on Twitter.
I'm sure
yes,
exactly. There was another word today that many of us and others took note of. Brennan going one step further in his testimony, bringing up a word no other senior U.S. official involved in this investigation has uttered so far. Have a listen.
Frequently, individuals who go along that treasonous path do not even realize they're along that path until it gets to be a bit too late.
Again, certainly, I should be clear here, not confirming treasonous activity took place, but raising a question, a very serious one of many unresolved questions here. And I asked people close to Brennan today, did he intentionally raise that question? And yes, he did.
Of course. That's a strong word
with the qualifier. This unwitting versus, you know, the kind of useful idiot scenario where you go down a path that perhaps you didn't intend to go down.
Exactly.
But that's a remarkable word to hear today.
People watching at home may be like, well, how do you not know that you're going down a treasonous path? How do you not know? And the way it's been explained to me is that the Russians, it's a long game for them. It happens over years where they just it's a slow roll, and they just try to befriend you and get you on their side, do a favor. And so you can, before you know it, you're doing favors for them, but not realizing sort of what the situation is. And keep in mind, this is
actually a really important point in the FBI investigation, because one of the things the FBI has been struggling with in this investigation is trying to discern what are business contacts. A lot of these people were doing business. At the same time, they're trying to pretend that they had some kind of juice inside the Trump campaign. So they were mixing business and politics. And the Russians were only too glad to do this because they like to do this as well. And so, you know, a lot of the people who perhaps some of these people were dealing with are business people, but then when they go back to Moscow or back to Russia, they are reporting back to the FSB.
Put this on top of Sally Yates's testimony, where there's another person who ran to the White House with her hair on fire. And she talked about General Flynn potentially being subject to blackmail. And you talk about how you turn somebody. Well, if you have enough communication, if you are paid substantially by a government or for a speech, or you know, there is a way to cultivate. And then at some point, which was Sally Yates's point, you have to start worrying that if this person is in the government, they can be subject.
And you guys
the
are reporting
Yates
we had Friday about the bragging among Russian officials of
About
their ability to cultivate.
Yates' issue was specific to perjury. Had he lied about his communications? The other question of influence is money, right? And investment, which is an issue that has been raised about the president himself, never substantiated, but is one of the reasons why investigators, at least on the Democratic side, have wanted to have records, financial records, so they can establish if there's any undue influence.
It's always follow the money. I mean, that's just the bottom line in any investigation. But I think you guys have all laid out the why and the how. But I just want to go back to the term, treasonous. I mean, that was a showstopper today when he said that word. And the fact that you were told that that was not unintentional, which, given what we know about Brennan, is probably not surprising. He uses his words carefully. It's pretty remarkable, especially given the fact that one of the questions, as we hear more and more about this, is, okay, things were maybe untoward, unethical, didn't really feel right, but was anything illegal? Treason is illegal.
And look, it's going to be interesting to see when James Comey does testify before the Senate Intelligence Committee. You know, one of the senators, of course, is going to ask him, do you agree with John Brennan's sworn testimony that there could have been a treasonous act here? And James Comey is a private citizen now. We'll see what he says.
Is concern setting in on the Republican side? I ask you that question almost every 3 days, but I think it's a fair question because every 3 days or every day we have new information.
Yes, it is. And I think that the Republicans are allowing this investigation to go forward, not knowing where it's going to lead. I asked the Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell this exact question today. Does he have concerns, particularly of the president's actions and appearing to have maybe interfered with some of these investigations? He didn't say if he had concerns. He refused to say. He said, I'm going to let the investigations play out. That is what they're saying publicly, but privately they're very nervous.
Well, we're gonna have a lot more time to dig deeper on this going forward.
Yeah, a lot of news tonight, and coming up, the case against the White House, multiple incidents where the president is accused of trying to influence the Russia investigation. We'll
look at that and get new details on how far Mr. Trump will go to defend himself. We're back in a minute with much more on our special report.
Correspondent Jim Acosta is traveling with him, and the president now expected to hire an outside attorney. Is that right, Jim?
That's right. That's right, Pam. We should point out we're in Rome. We're at the Vatican, just outside the Vatican, where later today the president will meet with Pope Francis. So perhaps he's feeling that he has to appeal to a higher authority than the FBI Director James Comey, looking for some divine intervention in this investigation. But yes, you're right. If that doesn't work out, he's going the legal route. He's hired an outside attorney in the form of Mark Kasowitz. You just mentioned him a few moments ago. He will be the outside legal mind that will help the president through this morass that he'll be facing throughout this Russia investigation. We don't think that Mark Kasowitz will be the sole lawyer on this team. We think he'll be a part of a larger legal team. And in the meantime, the president and his team, they are looking for some sort of crisis communications team to handle what will undoubtedly be a very difficult PR problem for the president. And we're picking up from our sources that perhaps the former campaign manager for Donald Trump, Corey Lewandowski, may be a part of that. Of course, that is going to be a tough challenge for some people inside the White House, namely the president's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, his daughter, Ivanka Trump, who were very instrumental in forcing Corey Lewandowski out of the campaign during that election cycle. So we'll have to see if that exactly pans out. In the meantime, we should point out that the White House was really pushing back on the notion that the president has been distracted by this Russian investigation during this foreign trip. They said to reporters earlier today that they're focused on the objectives of this trip, and they released a statement saying basically that over the course of a year of an investigation that there's been no evidence found of collusion between the Trump campaign and Russia. But we should point out there are a couple of problems with that statement. One is this investigation has not been going on for a year. And at the same time, we should also point out while there may not be evidence of collusion so far, Pam, there certainly is evidence, and there has been some reporting out there that the president obviously has been trying to influence this investigation, and so that is obviously something that's going to be playing out in the days and weeks and months to come. But in the meantime, a big development for the president and his staff over at the White House. The president hiring an outside counsel to deal with this Russia investigation, Pam.
All right, Jim Acosta bringing us the latest there from Rome. Thanks so much, Jim. Back with our panel now. You know, Dana, it strikes me that all of a sudden you have the White House building this war room. You have the president hiring outside attorney. The Russia probe has been going on since last July. Former FBI Director Comey announced it last March. Why now? What do you think the impetus was? Why now?
2 words: special prosecutor. I mean, they know enough about history, recent history and not so recent history, to know that that could lead anywhere. They have officially lost control, not that they had it, but even some semblance or notion that clearly the president thinks that he had, given the conversations that he had, inappropriate ones, with people who were leading the investigation, but they realize that this could go anywhere. And they need to lawyer up, and that starts with the president. In addition to that, people who I have talked to who worked in the Clinton administration who had this experience say that it is actually a good thing for the White House staff, for the president to have a lawyer or a team of lawyers, so that when they sit in front of the press and they get bombarded with questions, as they are going to and as they have, their answer can be, I don't know, ask the president's lawyer, John Doe, or, you know, in the Clinton administration, it was Lanny Davis. So it is actually helpful for the White House staff if they want to try to focus on what the president campaigned on.
Governing.
Right. And what's interesting, too, is that it's not just the president lawyering up. We're told that the White House staffers, White House officials are doing the same. Clearly, there is a sense of concern, of potential panic. When you look at Mark Kasowitz, who was hired by President Trump, we've been told through a source, he is someone who doesn't have a lot of experience in counterintelligence investigations, though he does have a close relationship with Donald Trump. He's worked with him before. There is a familiarity there. What do you think about this pick, Dana, or Gloria, first to you, and Jim, I'd like to hear what you say, especially when you look at some of his clients that have to, in the Russia realm.
Well, he does have clients in the Russia realm. I think the most interesting thing to me is his relationship with Donald Trump. Donald Trump went for somebody he's comfortable with. He's represented him for 15 years. Donald Trump is not going to pick a new guy that he doesn't know. He's going with somebody and that he does know. And let me give you some examples. This is the attorney who sued the Trump biographer, Timothy O'Brien, because he understated Trump's net worth. That was a real problem. That got thrown out of court. He threatened to sue the New York Times recently during the campaign if it did not retract a story about women who were accusing Trump of acting inappropriately. He threatened the New York Times with legal action over the publication of that one page of Trump's tax return. So he has been doing Trump's bidding, but he doesn't have Washington experience.
He doesn't, and the optics of this. I mean, the optics of someone, he has represented big Russian banks. He has represented he is representing, as we speak, a Russian oligarch. What do you think about the optics?
And also a potential conflict with the possible FBI director, Joe Lieberman, having worked in the same law firm as Lieberman. If Lieberman does get the nod, they'll raise questions about, here's one attorney who is representing the president against a probe with the FBI director hailing from the same place, even though his bureau, assuming will be assisting with the special counsel's prosecution. This is the investigation. The question is, does the White House care about the conflicts of interest, and do Republicans care about
you get a sense why he's building a team as opposed to having one lawyer here, right? Because you have a particular kind of lawyer, certainly a personal relationship, as Representative Trump in every kind of case, from women to finances, etc. Not, you would imagine, the perfect resume for a special counsel in a state actor kind of investigation. But you have other names coming up, like Ted Olson, former Solicitor General. You know, you get a sense that they're going to have a few folks around the table with a few different kinds of roles in this defense.
And what's emerging, though?
Well,
what's emerging here, though, is the picture here of the Trump administration actually trying to learn from the playbook of the Clinton administration, which was able to fend off and survive, you know, the entire the impeachment proceedings and all that, and also looking at Iran-Contra and seeing how the Reagan administration was able to survive all of that. And look, part of the trick here is for the president to actually embrace this investigation, because that is how he will be able to survive this. If he doesn't do that, and if he keeps sending tweets out where he, you know, attacks Bob Mueller as
you just said the president embraced the Russia investigation. Did you?
I mean, that's exactly.
It's funny that you said that. It's funny you said that, because I interviewed John McCain this morning, and he said exactly that. He said his experience in Washington with an administration that did it the right way, his words, was Iran-Contra, and it was because the president came clean. He said he made a mistake. He said it, you know, it was a problem, and
he didn't call it a witch hunt.
He didn't call it a witch hunt. He didn't do that.
see him changing his tune on this, Jim?
We don't know if that's even in the
But he
realm
didn't
of...
He's
shut
shown
it
no
down.
evidence of that.
He embraced it and said we will get to the bottom of it. When they got to the bottom of it, he did admit that there was a mistake had been made, Reagan.
Yeah.
And he didn't go to people in his administration and say, shut it down. And I was talking to a friend of Donald Trump's today who said, you have to understand his mindset here. He believes these people work for him. So he can go to the FBI director and say, shut it down, because he works for him, fix it. And that's not the way
you
the
make a good point,
government
because
works.
it's not, we're not in the stage of embracing, but rather challenging and trying to kill, right? Trying to kill the investigation.
Yeah, exactly.
Just ahead, the former CIA director testifies on Capitol Hill, telling lawmakers for the first time about his alarming realization that Russia was meddling in the election, and his growing concern about Russia's ability to lead Americans down what he calls a treasonous path.
And here to talk about it, a congressman on the Intelligence Committee who calls the Watergate with a foreign partner.
We're back with our special report, White House in Crisis. Breaking tonight, CNN confirms that President Trump is expected to hire a personal lawyer outside of his White House legal team to represent him in the Russia investigation.
This on a day of bombshell testimony by former CIA Director John Brennan. And join us now to discuss all of this, a member of the House Intelligence Committee, Democratic Congressman Mike Quigley. Congressman, thank you so much for coming on the show. So much to discuss, and really some big revelations coming from John Brennan's testimony today. Of course, the former CIA Director really expressing his concern about the contacts between Russians and Trump campaign associates during the campaign. And then, of course, you had a closed-door session with him after. What was the big takeaway for you?
The fact that he reinforced what had happened, what Director Comey said. There is an investigation. The Russians did successfully hack into our democratic process, and there were connections between the Trump campaign and the Russians. Reinforcing that to the American public.
But he stopped short of saying that he knew of collusion. He stopped short of that. He said it was unresolved. What did you make of that?
I think that's why the investigation continues. It's easy to forget we're in the infancy of this investigation, and we're already at the point that he talked about today. We haven't brought forth any one of those witnesses in this list that we've talked about. We have many more hearings to go and more documents to read.
You heard the White House reaction today, and they said, as the president has said many times before, and the White House has said before that, saying, you heard Director Brennan today. He said there's no evidence of collusion. In fact, he didn't say there's no evidence. He said that it's just not a resolved question. You're hearing from him both in public session and in private session, where, of course, you get into classified materials that you can't discuss. But just to be clear to our viewers, did he eliminate the possibility of collusion? Did he say to you that there is no evidence of collusion?
I think when the director says that his radar went up, that they pulled this and they wanted to find out exactly what took place, he said that in open session, and that expressed a lot of concerns. He said very specifically, this is why the investigation needs to go forth. What I have said is, if you had read what I had read and heard what I had heard, the American public would want this investigation to go forward full throttle. I think that's what the director said again today.
And after this closed session, were you more alarmed after the session than perhaps before?
No, I think what the director was reinforcing is the information that we've been collecting all along. I think it's another major player in the intel community reinforcing where this investigation is at this time and the fact that it has to go forward.
Were you surprised to hear the former director of the CIA utter the word treasonous? in public session regarding Russian interference?
Yeah, I've heard various choices now in terms of what kind of offenses we could conceivably be talking about. Acting as an agent of a foreign power, today treason. You know, at some point in time, what I tell folks is, even if there was no crime, the fact that agents of a major political party were cooperating, potentially cooperating with the Russians, our enemy for all of our lifetimes, is as big a thunderbolt of news as they probably would have gotten since Watergate.
You said cooperating, then you said potentially cooperating, but what do you mean specifically? What can you tell us in terms of what you've seen about cooperating?
Yeah, in open session, Director Comey said, upon my questioning, that he doesn't think collusion is a legal term of art. So he used the word cooperation.
But have you seen anything indicating cooperation?
Well, what I've said is not enough evidence to take it to a jury, but enough evidence to take it to a grand jury, right? There's enough probable cause to believe that there was cooperation. Clearly enough evidence to go forward and find out more. Again, we still haven't interviewed any of our witnesses, and we're already at this point.
And the cooperation on what? The timing of the release of information, the stolen emails during the election? What do you mean when you say cooperation?
Yeah, just, at this point, all I can say is cooperation in general. We'll leave it at that.
I want to get to the administration's response as well, because the FBI director said that he called his Russian counterpart with the FSB, called a Russian spy chief, in effect, in the midst of this, I believe in June last year. So that's several months before the Obama administration fingered Russia publicly in October, a month before the election. So he already knew that this was happening then. Why so long for the Obama administration to react? In retrospect, do you believe the administration should have acted more quickly and more strongly to this interference?
Yeah, I think what you might take from that is the Obama administration didn't want to tilt the campaign or give the appearance that they were releasing information to affect the campaign. Looking back, knowing what we know now, I wish they had all called press conferences and told us exactly what they know.
I should say the phone call was in August, but still 2 months before, the phone call to the FSB, 2 months before they publicly fingered Russia with that famous statement now, before the election.
Right. All right. Thank you so much, Congressman Quigley. Appreciate it.
We appreciate it. We look forward to staying in touch.
Yep. And coming up, new subpoenas for Michael Flynn. Senators don't want to let a pivotal figure in the Russia probe get away with pleading the Fifth.
And a new sighting of former FBI Chief James Comey as he gets ready for his big testimony on the Hill next week. We'll have more. Stay with us.
Well, tonight, leaders of the Senate Intelligence Committee are going to new lengths to get answers from fired National Security Advisor Michael Flynn, and they're continuing to dangle the threat of holding Flynn in contempt of Congress. I want to bring in Manu Raju. It is clear, Manu, that senators are really digging in their heels to this plea from Flynn of the Fifth.
Yeah, and they're trying to figure out new ways to get him to comply with the Senate Intelligence Committee's request for records. Now, this, of course, comes after him saying, his attorney saying that he would plead the Fifth for any records related to his contacts with Russian officials that occurred over the last couple of years. But this new tactic to issue 2 subpoenas towards his businesses, the belief being from Richard Burr, the Republican chairman of the committee, that the businesses cannot plead the Fifth, so presumably they can get records that way. Also, they're trying to get Flynn's attorney to explain exactly why he can plead the Fifth on the issue of record production rather than coming in before the committee and saying, I will not testify under oath. The question is what happens next when presumably they do not comply with this, and whether or not they try to hold him in contempt of Congress for not doing it. That is a threat that's on the table. It's a threat that would take some time to enforce, but it's something that they want to do, not just to send a message to Flynn, but to others, potential witnesses who may want to stonewall the committee.
Is that a severe penalty if he's found in contempt of Congress?
It could be, but it could take a long time to go through the legal proceedings, and it may not result in what the committee wants, but it's something that he should take pretty seriously.
And also, you were there today, but just see on the television screen the image of the Republican chairman and the top Democrat of the Intelligence Committee working hand in hand, talking about subpoenaing and potentially holding in contempt of Congress a Republican president's former national security advisor is rather remarkable. And it certainly, sort of throws very, very cold water on the notion that this is a political witch hunt.
And this is a Republican ranking member who initially was sort of reluctant to issue the subpoena. I mean, they did, and now...
And the question is, how hard does he go? He may even decide to haul Flynn before the committee and just have him actually stand up there and plead the fifth, which would be, of course, very embarrassing to Michael Flynn.
But,
we'll see if he does that.
Here's somebody who's asked for immunity, don't forget. So there's a little hardball going on here because they don't want to give him immunity. Right. He wants immunity. He says he's got a great story to tell, and they're saying, "Well, we're going to get your story anyway, and we're not going to give you one."
The other thing is,
go ahead.
Anytime you bring up General Flynn, you have to remember, you have to acknowledge as a group that this is a decorated general. He served alongside General McChrystal in Afghanistan and Iraq. That pairing credited with successfully snuffing out al-Qaeda in Iraq, right? He has this long history. We just had Richard Ledeen on the air, who wrote a memoir with him, and speaking of him in the highest terms. And you hear this. I speak to people who served with him, and they repeat that. And I think we just have to be conscious of that in there. It doesn't take away of what he's accused to have done during the campaign, but in the whole picture, it's a remarkable fall for a man with a remarkable history.
I got to tell you, having spent time with Michael Flynn, and talking to him in depth about his views on Islam and on a lot of the issues down in the Middle East where he's served, a lot of people will tell you that they don't recognize the guy who is part of this circus.
From the battlefield, yeah.
They don't recognize the guy that they knew and the guy today. And so I got to tell you the same thing. I mean, I don't know who this person is.
And now that guy is being targeted by the ranking Republican, talking about contempt of Congress. Let's take a listen to Senator Burr saying that today.
At the end of that option is a contempt charge. And I've said that everything is on the table.
And, of course, that is the chairman of the committee. I want to bring in Richard Painter, who was the ethics lawyer under the Bush administration, to sort of break it down, put it into context. First of all, as we know, Richard, Michael Flynn is pleading the fifth, and he will not turn over documents in response to the subpoena. Can you withhold business documents under the fifth?
Generally, no. You can withhold testimony, and you can only withhold documents in a situation where your act of producing the documents in itself is incriminating, where you are admitting custody of documents, or these are documents that the government didn't even know existed, so you're admitting they exist and therefore incriminating yourself. So there are a few situations where documents could be withheld under the Fifth Amendment. But, of course, they can always give a limited use immunity and get around the problem that way. In other words, say, well, you produce the documents, and the fact that you produced them wouldn't itself be introduced to a jury for purposes of trying to criminally convict you. So there are lots of ways to get around this, but documents generally have to be produced one way or another. And I think the committee will get them.
So do you buy this at all, or do you think this is just a game of hardball, as my colleague Gloria said, because Michael Flynn wants immunity, so his lawyer, his team is trying to get leverage here?
Oh, yes, obviously. He's in deep trouble. It's quite clear that he lied about his contacts with the Russians. And that in itself that's a criminal offense. He's asked for immunity from prosecution in return for telling his story, in effect turning state's evidence. They think they get the story out of him without the immunity, and so this is going back and forth. He obviously wants to cut as good a deal as he can for himself. He's definitely in very hot water. This is a very serious investigation. We've heard the word treason mentioned. Whoever was collaborating with the Russians certainly is guilty of something like treason. So this is going to be investigated. We'll find out what's going on. But he's just trying to cut as good a deal as he can for himself. And right now he's going to withhold the documents. And we'll see where it goes from here.
Richard, based on what you know, will Flynn likely be charged by Congress with contempt?
Well, if he doesn't produce the documents, I think that would be the next step to once again demand the documents. If they don't, refer this for criminal prosecution for contempt. That could take a while. The other option is to give some sort of immunity from prosecution with respect to the documents themselves that are produced, some limited immunity, and they could look into that. So it's going to be a negotiation. I think it's going to be critically important to get the documents, and they may have to give them something in return, they may not.
Okay, Richard Painter, thank you so much for your insight and knowledge on this subject. And coming up, is James Comey getting ready for his close-up when he testifies before Congress in the days ahead?
We'll show you what the fired FBI director has been up to right after this break. Tonight, the White House is clashing with a top government watchdog, and Senate Democrats are vowing to use all tools available to force the Trump administration to hand over any ethics waivers it may have granted to executive branch officials. Our Gloria Borger has been following the breaking news. So, Gloria, I mean, the key here is basically the Trump administration allowing folks, in effect, to break ethics rules, and then they're not revealing that took place.
Yeah, and the Obama administration did that, and when they gave somebody a waiver, it became public, and you understood why, so you would understand why they'd go in the administration. In this case, I talked with Walter Schaub, who's the head of the Office of Government Ethics, and he thinks, as he put it, this is extraordinary, adding to me that there has never been anything like this. He is not going to back down. I think the question that he and others want the answer to is how many waivers are there in the White House, for example? Who is getting those waivers? Why don't we know about it? What conflicts of interest are there? And how many waivers are there throughout the entire government?
And these are about folks who lobbied the government who are now being allowed in.
Right. And, you know, this was an administration that ran on draining the swamp. Remember that? So these issues of conflicts are very, very important. And we don't know how many people are getting waivers, and that's what Schaub is trying to find out.
Richard Painter, you obviously dealt with this issue often in the Bush administration. Is this a major issue, and is this something that needs to be revealed to the public as well?
Well, it is a major issue if the White House is going to refuse to turn basic information about ethics waivers over to the Office of Government Ethics. If the Bush White House had taken that position and said that I should not turn over to the Office of Government Ethics basic information like this, I would have quit. There's no way you could do that. The Office of Government Ethics has a statutory mandate to implement the ethics program throughout the executive branch, and there's no reason to withhold this information.
Richard Painter, thanks very much. We got Comey testifying next week.
Do.
Where is he, Pamela?
Well, that is the big question. It seems as though members of Congress have had a hard time tracking him down. Of course, as we look ahead to tomorrow, he has been asked to turn over documents related to the investigation. I've been told that as of today, he has not talked to Robert Mueller, who is overseeing the special probe, and doesn't want to hand over anything until he speaks to him formally, which apparently hasn't happened yet. But he has sort of been hard to track down.
Oh, yeah, he's been hard to track down. Members of Congress who've been trying to reach him to get him to talk to them about whether or not he's going to come testify, turn over these documents. I've had to resort to some extraordinary means, including sending letters to his P.O. box, which is at a mailboxes, etc. store near his home in Northern Virginia. That's the lengths to
and
which...
so basically, someone at a barber shop has an easier time finding him than members of Congress, right?
Exactly.
There we go.
There it is.
A man's got to get his hair cut.
Man's got to get his hair cut. But it's really remarkable to me that members of Congress sort of scramble to find the former FBI director.
They're scrambling to find him, and it also begs the question. The Intelligence Committee on the Senate side announced that he is going to publicly testify after the Memorial Day recess. But I talked to Mark Warner today, the top Democrat, and, you know, he said he thinks that he's going to be able to tell the whole story. He hopes that Comey is going to be able to fully explain what went on in his conversations with the president. But he's not entirely sure. And to your point about he's waiting to hear from Bob Mueller, the special prosecutor, about turning over documents, he also clearly wants to talk to his old friend and now the guy running the investigation about what he will or will not say. So it's an open question.
And several committees want those memos, too. That deadline tomorrow, the Senate Judiciary Committee, also the House Oversight Committee want those memos. And I talked to the top Democrat, upset that Comey, first of all, is testifying before the Intelligence Committee and not their committee, even though they have oversight over the FBI. But they are not ruling out the idea of issuing subpoenas for those memos if they don't get a good reason not to, if Comey decides not to turn them over.
And we've talked to friends of Comey who have told us what he was thinking at the time, that he thought perhaps it was an obstruction, that he could teach the president how to behave properly in talking to the FBI director about an ongoing investigation. But these are his friends. We haven't heard from him, and he needs to explain why. If he didn't think it was obstruction of justice, what was he thinking?
And he's someone who likes to protect his reputation, and I think he does want to come out and tell the story. Yeah, that's right.
One little part of the story I think that is getting lost is the idea that even though there's a good job to try to rescue his reputation, the FBI's reputation is getting hurt.
All right.
That's it for us. Thanks so much for watching us again tonight. I'm Jim Sciutto.
And I'm Pamela Brown. AC360 is next.